Hi, it's Katrina. Cloning a mammoth. Harvard University genetics professor George Church is one of the leading minds in genome sequencing and gene splicing. Dr. Church is hoping that within the next few years, he will be able to clone mammoth DNA so that the extinct woolly mammoth can walk across the Arctic tundra once more. The company he is working with, Colossal, says they are currently working toward bringing back species that went extinct, primarily the woolly mammoth. Colossal believes they can create a hybrid using gene editing tools to splice together DNA from frozen mammoth remains found in the Siberian tundra with DNA from an Asian elephant. The Asian elephant is the closest living relative to the mammoth, and the resulting offspring created would be known as the mammophant. It would be physically born using the Asian elephant as a surrogate, but would look and act primarily like a woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth is one of the most recent prehistoric beasts to have gone extinct. Some researchers say that small populations lived in Siberia up until roughly 1700 BC. The largest of these creatures grew to over 10 feet at the shoulder and weighed upwards of 15 tons. What's also interesting about mammoths is that they maintained the permafrost. Part of their behavior was scraping away layers of snow so that cold air filtered into the soil. They were a key part of the ecosystem but went extinct, quite likely due to intense hunting by early humans. Lost viruses. Scientists in Siberia recently uncovered an ancient virus hiding underneath the permafrost. The virus was identified as Mollivirus sibericum, and it belongs to a group called giant viruses. As scary as that sounds, the world is not currently at risk of being devastated by yet another pandemic. At least not this one. Since 2003, researchers have found at least 4 major giant viruses frozen in the permafrost. Some believe the extraction of these viruses could bring about global trouble, but nothing all that dangerous has been discovered as of yet. If anything, scientists are using these viruses to learn more about the role climate change plays on sickness and disease. The Mollivirus is estimated to be around 30,000 years old. It's classified as a giant because unlike most viruses that you need an electron microscope to see, the Mollivirus is visible using a perfectly ordinary microscope that you might find in any high school science class. Giant viruses also contain far more genes, upwards of 500 genes, while things like the human immunodeficiency viruses only carry 9. While not immediately a threat, other viruses like this could pose a problem. Researcher Jean-Michel Claverie says that even with the virus frozen in the ice, there could be a few viral particles that are still infectious. And if these infectious particles come into contact with a vulnerable host, the pathogenic virus could spread. It's just a good thing scientists haven't found anything immediately deadly, and we shouldn't worry about catching an ancient virus anytime soon. Exploding holes. In Siberia, the ground sometimes spontaneously blows up. Massive gas explosions have been erupting underneath the icy soil of Siberia, seemingly unprovoked. It's a very recent phenomenon, and one scientists say is linked to climate change. Craters can now be found all across the Siberian landscape, like pockmarks across the snowy wasteland. The international community first took notice of these strange explosions in 2014 and have been trying to understand them ever since. Evgeny Chuvalin from the Skoltech Center for Hydrocarbon Recovery in Moscow says it's a pure stroke of luck that no fatalities have been caused by the explosions. Many of the craters were found not more than a few miles from commercial areas, where someone could have been standing right in the blast zone. But what's causing the ground to explode? That's the big question, and scientists believe they know the answer. Due to global warming, the surface permafrost is becoming weakened by the thawing process. With this layer of ice gone, there is nothing to keep pressure on the pools of methane gas that have formed deep under the ground. Then, the methane gas can't be held back, and it explodes out of the surface. It's like screwing the plastic cap off a carbonized drink very slowly until suddenly it's too weak to hold back the pressure. Since this is due to climate change, there is no end in sight for the random explosions. They will continue to happen throughout Siberia, wherever the permafrost becomes too weak and too thin. The Cyan Warrior. In 2003, the brutalized remains of an ancient Scythian warrior were found in Siberia at the archaeological site of Arzan II. The warrior, along with about 40 others, was buried inside of a massive grave mound. But out of all the skeletal remains found, this man in particular had a very rough time at the end of his life. Researchers meticulously inspected his skeleton. They discovered that in his youth, he had survived a sword blow to the back of his skull. Then, as an adult, he took a triple barbed arrowhead straight to the eye. It shattered the bone under his right eye and lodged into his head. According to Michael Schultz from the University of Göttingen, he was most certainly begging for death. But death did not come as swiftly as the man may have wished. 2,600 years ago, on the cold Siberian steppes, the warrior's comrades tried to help him. Researchers found thin cuts on the bone from where his friends had sliced away his cheek meat in order to try and get the arrow out of his head. They then attempted to use a saw to cut off pieces of bone, still trying to get the arrow dislodged. Finally, a surgeon cracked the bone with a chisel to try to free the arrowhead, but instead, the man died. It was utter torture, but just another day in prehistoric Russia. Teenage woolly rhino. The remains of a teenage woolly rhino were found in 2020 in the Yakutia region of Siberia, not far from the remote Terek River. This ancient specimen was so well preserved that its brain was still fully intact. Scientists determined it was likely only between 3 and 5 years of age when it passed away. Surprisingly, the adolescent rhino was not at all like the rhinos we see today. In fact, instead of the rough gray skin of African rhinos, it had a thick layer of hair covering its body. It had an extraordinary coat of hazel-colored fur, one thick horn, and great big chompers that it used to crush up its food. The woolly rhinoceros was dated to have lived about 20,000 years ago. It was found to be extremely healthy at its time of death, so well fed that it even had a hump of fat on it. Researchers believe it could have died after it was chased by predators into the water, where sadly it drowned. The Dancing Figurine. Not far from the city of Novosibirsk, a construction crew made a shocking discovery while working on a bridge project along the banks of the Ob River. Completely by accident, the team uncovered a small figurine that left them utterly perplexed. The figurine was carved into the likeness of a human caught in the middle of a dance, or perhaps some type of spiritual movement. It was made of pure bronze, a kind of dancing figurine dating back to at least 2,100 years ago. Professor Andrei Borodovsky is an archaeologist with the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he was interviewed about the mysterious figurine by the Siberian Times. He stated that the statue is of an Indian religious dancer, and that it doesn't have anything to do with Siberia or the ancient people who once lived there. It's a major mystery because Novosibirsk and India are separated by roughly 3,000 miles of mountainous terrain. For such a statue to make it so far would have been a journey like no other. The professor labeled the discovery as one of the most significant in the history of Siberian archaeology. He believes the only way the figurine made it from India to Siberia was through trade. It would have been traded multiple times, like a dollar bill that ends up circumnavigating the globe. Someone in India most likely traded it to someone on the Silk Road, and the trading continued until it finally made its way to the Ob River. Because it was found at the exact point where the river is at its narrowest, researchers believe whoever had this thing on them was trying to cross. They must have lost it during the crossing, and it got stuck in the sediment for over 2,000 years. The Oldest Permafrost. An international team in Siberia, somewhat accidentally, came across the oldest permafrost in the entire region. They were determining the age of a permafrost layer when they identified the soil at its deepest point to be 650,000 years old. What this means is that the deepest layer of ice in Siberia has been there for over 500,000 years. It's located at the eastern side of the village of Batagai, approximately 164 feet beneath the surface. It's an incredible discovery for one primary reason. According to Dr. Thomas Opel from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Potsdam, the ancient permafrost shows that even during warm weather, it doesn't necessarily melt. This is a big surprise, and something scientists hadn't even really considered. 130,000 years ago, there was a warm spell when the Arctic was around 41 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it is today. Yet, despite being so much warmer, the permafrost didn't melt. It stayed put, and when the temperature dropped, more and more layers of ice formed to create the wilderness of Siberia we know today. Lion cubs. A pair of cave lion cubs have recently been found in Russia. The first to be discovered was a male lion cub named Boris, who was unveiled in 2017. A mammoth tusk collector was looking for ancient ivory along a river in Siberia when he came across the body of the lion. He was estimated to be about 43,448 years old. The year after, a female cub was found less than 50 feet away from the male cub. Researchers named her Sparta, and they say she died 27,962 years ago. That means over 16,000 years separated the lion cubs. Yet they died at the same place and were buried about 30 feet deep in the ice. Both of them were only a couple of months old when they became mummified. Cave lions lived across Europe and Asia up until about 10,000 years ago. They were very similar to modern lions, but more adapted to the frigid climate of the north. They were also about 20% bigger than modern lions. Males didn't have manes, and they were far more terrifying than any predator alive today. Even though they are related to modern African lions, the cave lions would have made them look like baby house cats. Professor Love Dalen with Stockholm University says the female cub Sparta is the best preserved specimen from the Ice Age ever dug out of the frozen soil. She is so remarkably preserved that the color of her fur is still the same as when she was alive. She has no connection to the other cub, and researchers aren't entirely sure why they were found in the same spot. It could have been a landslide that buried their dens 16,000 years apart. One very old bird. A frozen bird from the Ice Age was recently found in Siberia. On the outside, the specimen is pretty grotesque. Its wings are black and brown, and its insides appear to have spilled out. Its legs are also quite frail, and they almost look like tiny twigs. At first glance, it appears to be like any bird that may have fallen out of a tree and gotten stuck in the mud. However, this is dead wrong. This bird is surprisingly believed to be around 46,000 years old. Genetic analysis identified it as a horned lark, a bird that would have lived at the same time as some of the most fantastic beasts since the dinosaurs. It would have flapped its wings around woolly mammoths, maybe woolly rhinoceroses, and possibly even saber-toothed cats and cave bears. The bird was found frozen in the permafrost near the northeastern Siberian village of Belaya Gora. It was uncovered by fossil hunters, a group who searches through the ice and snow for prehistoric ivory and anything they might be able to sell to scientists. The bird specimen seemed pretty important, so they passed it on to researchers at the Swedish Museum of Natural History. After further analysis, researchers at the museum now understand more about this mysterious ancient bird. It was almost definitely the ancestor of two subspecies of larks still living today, one in Russia and the other in Mongolia. This is pretty amazing because it is direct evidence of climatic changes at the end of the Ice Age, leading to the formation of new subspecies. The birds were dying out, and evolution took over and propelled them into the future by subtly altering their DNA to better suit their new environment. Snow goggles. The oldest eyewear that has ever been found was used by the old Bering Sea culture, a group of people who lived on both sides of the Bering Strait. Some of these folks lived on the Russian side, while others had a camp on the North American side. They were almost certainly related, and both of them most likely came from Russia back when the Bering Strait was the Bering Land Bridge. But with the rise of the sea level, North America was cut off from the rest of the world. The peak of the old Bering Sea culture was likely in the 3rd century AD, although some say they may have survived all the way until 1300. At a graveyard in Ekven, dating back to the 1st century, researchers discovered a pair of extraordinarily old snow goggles made from pure bone. These were used by the people living in the farthest east of Siberia to keep from going blind while traversing the bright white landscape. Another interesting thing is that many of the snow goggles found were different from one another. Some were elaborately decorated, some were not. They were all the same basic design, but done slightly different to show off one's artistic uniqueness. The tradition of building snow goggles remained on both sides of the Bering Strait and was passed along to the Inuit, the Yupik, and the Chukchi. They made their goggles from whale bones and mammoth ivory. They also painted them black to receive even more protection from the brutal Arctic sun. Janira Fort. The Janira Fort is a mighty fortress built on an island in India, believed to have been occupied by a group called the Cities. They were supposedly the descendants of East African slaves who escaped bondage, formed their own small empire, and ruled a vast stretch of land from their fortification. They took the island over from a group of fishermen who built a small wooden village on the island. The cities then improved the wooden structures, starting work on the stone citadel in 1569. They would continue building for the next 150 years, completing one of the most impressive island strongholds in the world. The fortress spans for 22 acres. It has 19 towers, each one of which was once mounted with cannons and turrets. In the medieval days, the fortress had a reputation for being impenetrable. Despite many attempts, nobody could subdue the power of the cities. The British tried to take the fortress once, and so did the Portuguese and the Marathas, but they all failed. There were also attempts to tunnel beneath. Some invaders tried to scale the walls, but nobody could conquer the island, at least not until 1736, when a massive force beat the cities at the Battle of Rewas, confining them to their island. After that, their power diminished, and the whole place was eventually abandoned. China's stone circles. There are mysterious stone formations in China that were built thousands of years ago by nomadic people. These stone circles are on par with other megalithic sites found across Europe and in Britain. Many of them have been estimated at 4,500 years old, and experts aren't exactly sure what they were used for. Much like Stonehenge and other places in England, China's stone circles appear to be an unsolvable mystery. One of the most recent discoveries came from near Turpan City. Archaeologists in 2003 uncovered about 200 circular stone formations and started digging underneath them looking for tombs. But no tombs were found, and the government soon stepped in to stop digging and protect the ancient sites. But even though excavations appear to be forbidden for now, some researchers have still come forward to give their theories as to what these sites were used for. Liu Enguo, a local archaeologist, believes the stone circles were used in rituals. This opinion was seconded by Dr. Volker Hyde from the University of Bristol. He believes there was a mysterious civilization in prehistoric China and Mongolia who used stone circles for rituals, much like the Druids in ancient England. But there is a dark twist. The rituals may have involved sacrifices to a mysterious sun god. If further digging is done at the sites, archaeologists believe that they will start finding bodies of sacrifice victims. One of the stone circles was discovered near a place called the Flaming Mountains, which happens to be one of the hottest regions in the world. The ancient people who lived here likely lived in fear of the sun because of its intense strength. They may have sacrificed fellow humans as a way to appease the sun, keeping themselves safe from its fiery heat. The Roman Mithraeum. Underneath the streets of Rome are ancient temples dedicated to the Iranian god Mithras. There are an estimated 35 Mithraea hiding beneath the Eternal City. These were used 2,000 years ago as secret underground meeting places for practitioners of the cult of Mithraism. People met here to take part in covert rituals, the details of which continue to elude historians. One of the most famous of these sacred temples is the Roman Mithraeum underneath the Basilica of St. Clement. It's only a few minutes walking distance from the Colosseum. Looking over the railings at the remains of the gladiators' barracks and practice arena, you can see the facade of the basilica, built in the year 1108. But beneath its foundations, 2 stories beneath street level, is the Mithraeum. Legend has it that a nobleman converted his house into the temple. Then people from all over the city gathered to give praise to Mithras. The nobleman carved benches out of stone and built an altar. The altar is still there today, complete with an image of Mithras shown as a young man killing a sacred bull. There is also an image of a snake, which likely represents regeneration. At the time this underground temple was active, it would have been a forbidden place, somewhere that nobody mentioned openly. The cult met here in secret when Christianity was finding its roots in Rome. Then, in the 4th century AD, the Mithraeum closed. Its entrance was blocked off, the cult was suppressed and obliterated, and the temple was forgotten, and a church was built on top of it. Plum Island. Plum Island is a forbidden piece of land about 1.5 miles from the coast of Long Island in New York. For decades, rumors have been swirling about the kinds of secret government experiments going on in the high-security research facility. Some say they are making biological weapons. Others claim they are making animal-human hybrids. But what's the truth about Plum Island? Are they creating genetically modified monsters, or is it all just speculation? The truth is that in the early 1950s, Congress authorized the Department of Agriculture to build a laboratory that could fight animal diseases. About 100 years earlier, in the 1870s, Plum Island was used as a military fortification. It was the site of Fort Terry between 1879 and 1948. With World War II over, it seemed like a good time to convert the Army fort into a biological lab. Plum Island soon became a super prison for deadly animal diseases, but nobody has really been able to see what's going on with the island since its inception. The secrets are hidden behind security fences and biocontainment checkpoints. Inside its walls are believed to be some of the deadliest diseases known to humanity. Plum Island is currently due to be shut down in 2023 and replaced with a new facility in Kansas. What will happen to the island afterward, and if it will remain forbidden, is unknown. Big shout out to Billy McCoy and Robin Banks. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Gangui Temple. In 2015, a group of tomb raiders got caught trying to dig a tunnel into the ancient Gangui Temple in China. These criminal treasure hunters rented a restaurant near the old temple, then used it as a secret base as they dug an underground passageway. Their plan was to dig 164 feet to the temple, where they could then break inside undetected and pillage the treasure. You gotta give it to them for being creative. Specifically, the thieves wanted to reach the Hua Pagoda. It was built about 1400 years ago during the Tang Dynasty, which many historians consider to be the golden age of ancient Chinese culture. The pagoda is beautifully carved with images of elephants and other animals. Inside the temple is a small treasure constantly guarded and locked up tight. The thieves were hoping to tunnel beneath the structure, break through the floor, and then steal the forbidden treasure without anyone knowing. But they never made it there. They were captured after they dug about 65 feet of the tunnel. The authorities in China were given an anonymous tip about what was happening, and the would-be thieves were arrested. The underground city in the Grand Canyon. In the early 1900s, an archaeologist with the Smithsonian Institution was hired to make discoveries in the West. He explored places like Green River, Utah, the Colorado River, and wound up in the Grand Canyon. During the researcher's adventures, he came across something that to this day is hard to believe. In April of 1909, the Arizona Gazette printed a story about an explorer named G.E. Kincaid discovering a secret underground city in the Grand Canyon, and his discovery was truly remarkable. According to the story in the paper, Mr. Kincaid found a hidden entrance to a vast underground city, one populated by ancient Egyptian artifacts. He found deep passageways lined with statues, a shrine with images of mysterious gods, and hieroglyphics. The caverns appeared to have been carved by human hands, creating a complex labyrinth inside the Grand Canyon. The discovery was major news at the beginning of the 20th century. The passage supposedly went a mile underground, and there were several hundred rooms, each one filled with artifacts. The assumption was that a colony of Egyptians somehow crossed the ocean, walked across most of America, and then carved a home for themselves in the wall of the Grand Canyon thousands of years ago. Unfortunately, the story might not be true. Nobody has ever found proof of a subterranean city in the Grand Canyon. The artifacts that were supposedly hauled out are missing, and to be honest, none of it really makes sense. But at the same time, there are restricted areas and forbidden zones inside the Grand Canyon. These are places where ordinary people are not allowed to visit. Some say the forbidden zones are hiding the truth of the ancient cave dwellers. The Forbidden Temple. Archaeologists recently discovered something shocking in the Holy Land. They came across the location of what's been described as a forbidden Israelite temple, one which stood for centuries in violation of God. Even more shocking is that experts believe they've uncovered traces of cannabis at the ancient site, meaning worshippers at this temple may have been using marijuana. You might be familiar with the first and second temple in Jerusalem. The first one was destroyed in 587 BC by the Babylonians. Then it was reconstructed only to be destroyed by the Romans in 72 AD. But according to Tom Meyer, an expert in biblical studies at Shasta Bible College, there was a third great temple. It was hidden 6 miles west of Temple Mount in the Negev desert. Archaeologists uncovered its foundations in the 1960s. It was only recently that they began to make sense of the site. The temple was originally built in the fortress city of Tel Arad, dedicated to the Jewish god Yahweh. It likely functioned for about 300 years despite God's commandment in the Old Testament to only worship him at a single place, which in those days was Temple Mount. But by far the most shocking part was the discovery of the incense altars in the Forbidden Temple. Scientists found traces of frankincense and cannabis. During worship, the whole temple would have been filled with a gaseous aura of cannabis smoke. The Nubian City of the Dead. Archaeologists were excavating an ancient city of the dead in Africa when they came across mysterious tablets from 2,700 years ago. The site is called Sedenga, and it's located in modern Sudan. It's particularly famous for the ruins of a temple built in the 14th century BC to honor Pharaoh Tutankhamun's grandmother, Queen Taye. In the 7th century BC, the city became more of a burial ground. People from the kingdoms of Napata and Meroe were being buried here so frequently that the city soon became dotted with brick pyramids and deep tombs. It went from being an ordinary city to one haunted by the dead. The tablets here are fascinating because they show text written in the ancient language of Meroitic. Archaeologist Vincent Francigny says Meroitic is the oldest writing system in the sub-Saharan region. As for why the ancient city began to decline, the exact details around its fate are unknown. We know that about 2,200 years ago, the people began worshipping the dead, and soon after that, the city of Sedenga fell into ruins. China's Forbidden City. China is home to the Great Forbidden City, one of the most spectacular places on Earth. The city isn't that forbidden anymore. It's open to tourists and usually packed full of eager visitors. But before modern times, the Forbidden City was home to the emperors of China. It was the seat of the Chinese government for roughly 500 years. Between 1420 and 1912, the Forbidden City was only for Chinese royalty, royal families, people working for the emperor, and the emperor's vast harem of concubines. Within the closed city was the royal palace, and inside of that were the imperial quarters. All of the emperor's concubines were restricted to the imperial corridors, not allowed to leave the inner court, and prohibited from venturing into other parts of the city. This included maids and servants, but was particularly enforced for the concubines. The concubines were women whose duty it was to bear as many children for the emperor as they could. The tradition started about 2,000 years ago during the Jin dynasty. It continued until very recently. Emperors were allowed to take their pick of anyone in their kingdom. Young and unmarried women went through a selection process, and those chosen as suitable were sent to the Forbidden City to live out their days in total isolation. Their only friends were the other hundreds of women being hoarded by the emperor and essentially kept prisoner. The Zayat el-Aryan Pyramids. The 2 pyramids of Zayat el-Aryan are not known to many people. In fact, you might call these the most obscure Egyptian pyramids in the country. One of them is nothing but a foundation block, and the other is little more than a ruin. Archaeologists can't even figure out if they were ever finished or if they were blown apart during some mysterious war. Both pyramids are located north of Giza, built sometime around 2700 BC. The first is called the Layer Pyramid, and it was built by Pharaoh Khaba around 2670 BC. The second is called the Unfinished Pyramid, built about 60 years later. The Unfinished Pyramid is puzzling because no one knows who commissioned it. Excavations started in the early 1900s, headed by the Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti. But when World War I started, excavations stopped, and research didn't continue until 1954. Starting in 1964, the Unfinished Pyramid found itself within a restricted military zone. And for that reason, no modern excavations have been allowed. The necropolis is forbidden to archaeologists and is one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt.
The Animal Master. There are similar pieces of imagery that can be found throughout different cultures around the world. One of the most mysterious symbols found carved on temple walls and shaped into golden artifacts is that of the Animal Master. And while the imagery changes slightly depending on which culture we're looking at, it's always very much alike. The Animal Master is depicted as a giant man with two great beasts at his sides. Sometimes the beasts are lions, other times they appear to be huge serpents. Sometimes they're just birds. The one thing that never changes is that the individual is portrayed as a lord of animals. The Animal Master likely began as a Stone Age creation, a mysterious deity who ruled over the forests and jungles with animals following behind him. Just like how most civilizations across the world had their main deity as a sun god, from the Egyptians to the Inca, Stone Age people all seem to revere this great ruler of animals. The ancient Egyptians worshipped a nameless deity who controlled animals. We know this because of artifacts such as gold pendants rendered in the shape of the animal lord. The Mesopotamians also seem to worship a mysterious man who had great control over lions, whereas in Greece there was a goddess called the Mistress of Animals, as is evident by carved reliefs dating back to around 625 BC. The one thing that's clear is that all throughout the Near East and Egypt and parts of the Mediterranean, the Animal Master was worshipped starting over 3,000 years ago. We don't know where the inspiration came from, if the Animal Master was based on a real hero, or if it was all a coincidence. Heaven at the North Pole. According to ancient cultures around the world, the North Pole is a lot more than just ice and snow. Over half a dozen mythologies from across the globe have their sacred lands located at the North Pole. In Indian folklore, the North Pole is the location of Meru, which in Hindu mythology is the center of the universe and the home of the gods. Ancient legends speak of how a single day in Meru is equivalent to one human year. This was likely based on the idea that the North Pole has 6 months of daylight and 6 months of darkness. In the ancient Zoroastrian religion, the North Pole is suggested as the original home of the Aryans. The Aryans migrated south following the melting of the great ice shelves at the end of the Ice Age 12,000 years ago. This is something that may have really happened, with prehistoric people migrating south from the North Pole and spreading through Europe and Asia. As they went in search of new lands, they continued to tell tales of their homeland and the frozen world to the north. Chinese and Japanese mythologies describe the place of the gods being directly beneath the pole star, meaning the North Pole. The Norse spoke of a land of immortality at the North Pole. Even the Greeks envisioned a land called Hyperborea, where the sun shined for 24 hours a day. This was almost certainly in the Arctic Circle as well. And finally, the Celts also believed heaven was at the very north of the world, where winter lasted 6 months. Sargon and Moses. The biblical story of Moses begins with an insecure pharaoh. The pharaoh is worried about the growing Hebrew population in Egypt, and so he commands that all Hebrew male infants be slaughtered. The mother of Moses hides her newborn son by sending him adrift down the Nile in a basket. By coincidence, he winds up being discovered by the daughter of the pharaoh and is taken under the protection of Egypt's ruler. Moses will later, with the help of God, lead the Jewish people out of Egypt and to the Promised Land. But the story is much older than the Bible. In fact, almost identical stories can be found in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, and India. One of the most jarringly similar is the story of Sargon. The story was told 4,000 years ago. The Akkadian emperor Sargon the Great was born by a mother who was a high priestess. But since he was an illegitimate child and under threat of being killed, his mother sent him adrift down a river in a basket. The boy was discovered by a gardener, raised in a humble family, and then helped by the goddess Ishtar to fight his way to become king. These stories aren't identical, but are close enough to see how the origin story of Moses may have been passed down from one culture to another. The Statue of Liberty and Ishtar. The Statue of Liberty is the most recognized symbol of freedom and prosperity in the United States. It was built by the French sculptor Frédéric Bartholdi and given to the US as a gift in 1885. But did you know that the Statue of Liberty may have been based on an ancient goddess idolized by the Freemasons? The French sculptor and his Freemason friends referred to the woman as Libertà, but other cultures knew her by different names. The Romans adopted her as their own from the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who we can see in ancient carvings looked almost identical to the Statue of Liberty. The Romans changed her name from Ishtar to Libertas around the 5th century BC. She was the goddess of freedom and liberty, but was also the patron goddess of prostitution. So that's definitely something to consider. Slaves in ancient Rome even worshipped Libertas in hopes that she would grant them their freedom. Big shout out to Carol Freeman and Angry Gamer. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The God of Corn. In the ancient world, kingdoms often fought because they had drastically different beliefs. They had different gods, different rules to follow, and this led to conflict. But that wasn't the case for the Maya about 1,400 years ago. In the year 687, a war broke out between the capitals of Palenque and Tonina. The two kingdoms battled for 24 years until both were overwhelmed and destroyed. Historians have always thought that the war lasted so long because these two societies, although part of the same empire, had a different system of beliefs. But new archaeological discoveries have shown that both of them fervently worshipped the same god of corn. Archaeologists with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History found a stone disc at the ruins of Tonina. The disc is in almost perfect condition and shows the Maya corn god. It's almost identical to another archaeological discovery made at the rival city of Palenque. Researchers found a stucco sculpture showing the exact same god, proving that both cities shared the same beliefs. In this case, war had nothing to do with religious differences. The warring cities had similar cult practices, believed in the same things, but went to war anyway. Cynocephaly. Cultures across the globe used to believe in something called cynocephaly. This was a mythical phenomenon referring to a creature with the head of a dog and the body of a human. People from India, Greece, China, and Egypt all had stories of human-dog hybrid creatures. Some experts believe the dog-headed monsters of ancient lore were the original werewolves, or at least the inspiration for the moon-fearing monsters that came in later medieval folktales. In ancient Egypt, Anubis was the god of the dead, depicted as a human with the head of a dog. In Greece, during the 5th century BC, the physician Ctesias wrote a detailed report about the dog-headed creatures that lived in India. The Greek traveler Megasthenes also wrote about meeting a mysterious group of people in India who had dog heads and communicated through barking. The more famous ancient historian Herodotus even reported a tribe of similar creatures living east of Libya, secluded in the desert. What's really strange is that more than 1,000 years after these ancient reports of mysterious dog-headed humanoids, images of saints with dog heads started to appear in Eastern Orthodox Church imagery. For example, Saint Christopher was frequently drawn as a half-human and half-dog creature from the 10th century until the 18th century. These images can still be found in some ancient Byzantine churches. In the New Testament, Saint Christopher has the head of a dog, barks, and eats human flesh. He is only turned into a human after he accepts Christ and gets baptized. The question that remains is, were there truly dog-headed humans in the ancient world? And if so, what in the world happened to them? The Twin Ziggurats. The mythological Tower of Babel may have a direct connection to Mexico's Great Pyramid of Cholula. Although the two structures are located in different parts of the globe, they have some shocking similarities. The Tower of Babel appears in the Bible's book of Genesis. The narrative says that the people of the world came together following a great cataclysm and united under one language. They migrated to modern-day Iraq, built a great city, and tried to build a tower that could touch the heavens. But the supreme deity saw this as an insult and smashed their tower and splintered the language that had united them. This caused the humans to scatter across the planet and speak different languages. The source of the myth was likely a ziggurat in ancient Mesopotamia. It could have been the ziggurat of Etemenanki in Babylon. History tells us the ziggurat was restored during the days of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, and then 300 years later, destroyed by Alexander the Great. Moving to Mexico, the Pyramid of Cholula is the largest pyramid on Earth by volume. Although it isn't an exact twin of the ziggurat of Etemenanki, their stories are extremely similar. In Aztec mythology, the pyramid was a site of pilgrimage. They believed it was constructed by an ancient race of giants called Kinametsin. The giants wished to build a tower so they could reach the sun. But the creator god was sent into a fit of anger by this, and he destroyed the tower and scattered the race of giants, causing them to go extinct. It's almost the exact same story as the Tower of Babel. Anubis and Shalat. The death rituals of the Egyptians and the Mayans were oddly similar, making some wonder how these two cultures came up with their ideas of the afterworld. The Egyptians believed that Anubis, their dog-headed god of death, would lead the soul of the deceased into the underworld, where the dead would have to undertake a journey to reach Osiris. Osiris would then judge them either worthy or unworthy to enter paradise. If the person wasn't worthy, and their heart proved impure, they were thrown into the jaws of a monstrous crocodile god. The Maya believed in a similar process to reach eternal paradise. They even had their own god, kind of like Anubis. Shalat was the Maya and Aztec god of deformities and death. Just like Anubis, Shalat was depicted as a monstrosity with a dog head and a human body. And just like in Egyptian culture, the Maya believed that to reach paradise, a dead person needed to venture through the underworld and conquer a series of challenges. The Maya underworld was called Xibalba, but instead of being eaten by a monstrous crocodile, those who failed their test in the underworld were cast away into the void forever. The bucket and cone. The bucket and cone are two things that can be seen frequently in ancient Mesopotamian artwork. According to historians and archaeologists, these things were held in the hands of winged genies about 3,000 years ago. During the days of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, between 911 and 605 BC, the bucket and cone are found in reliefs throughout Assyrian palaces. The winged creatures can be seen holding a bucket in their left hand and a pine cone in the right hand. But what is the significance here? That's something that has been extremely controversial. Mainstream archaeologists say the winged creatures are mythological genies from Assyrian lore. However, there are no explanatory texts to confirm this. Sure, they may have been connected to ancient rituals of purification, but there might be something even stranger going on here. The pine cone in particular is extremely suspicious. Not only is it seen in these Assyrian sculptures, but also all over the ancient world. As far back as 1224 BC, the Egyptians showed Osiris with a pine cone at the end of his staff. Depictions of ancient Hindu deities can also be seen holding a pine cone in their outstretched hand. The Mesoamerican god Chicomecoatl was even depicted holding out a pine cone with one hand while gripping an evergreen tree in the other. This is the biggest shock because Mesoamerican cultures had no contact with Europe and Asia. The point is that no one understands what the ancient people knew about pine cones that we don't understand or appreciate today. Why did all these ancient cultures have an obsession with pine cones? And for that matter, why was it always gods who held them in their outstretched hands? The Giant and Osiris. There is something bizarre carved into the side of a hill in the English countryside. It's called the Cern Giant, and nobody really knows where it came from or how old it is. The carving is 180 feet tall, depicting a naked man holding a wooden club. He was created by carving shallow trenches in the ground and then filling those trenches with crushed chalk. It's a geoglyph, similar to those found in Peru in the Nazca Desert. Researchers believe the Cern Giant was also once holding a severed head in his other hand, but that part of the geoglyph has since been destroyed. Some historians have linked the image to the ancient myth of Hercules. It's never been proven, but it is one of the many theories. Another is that the giant has a direct connection to the constellation of Osiris, the Egyptian god of life and fertility. It's not that the giant has a direct connection to Osiris, but rather to the origins of the god's mythology. In Egyptian myth, Osiris was connected to the constellation of Orion. It was his home after his resurrection. The constellation of Orion was depicted in ancient times as a warrior wielding a club, and the Cern Giant happens to be pointing directly at the constellation of Orion in the sky, which certainly can't be a coincidence. At the end of the day, it's difficult to say what the connection is exactly and how deep the giant's ties are with Egypt. The Cern Giant, created at least 2,000 years ago, is a pretty obvious depiction of Orion, which suggests an even further connection to Osiris from Egypt. Could the Cern Giant have been made by enthusiasts of ancient Egyptian lore, or is it all just another coincidence?
The Curse of the Pharaohs. The Curse of Pharaohs has been blamed for a streak of misfortune, sudden illness, and unexpected death since the middle of the 20th century. The whole idea behind the curse is that if anyone disturbs the mummy of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, they will find themselves plagued by bad luck. And as much as that sounds like the plot of a movie, there are genuine instances of archaeologists being affected by mummy curses. Take the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter. There were grave warnings that all those involved would suffer misery and setbacks if they messed with the tomb. Sure enough, one of the first visitors to the tomb died after developing a fever. George Herbert, a financial backer of the excavation, died from a mosquito bite 4 months after. Another member of Carter's excavation team, A.C. Mace, died after an unanticipated spout of pneumonia. And finally, Carter's secretary, Richard Bethel, died from a smothering incident in 1929. The most surprising exception was Howard Carter himself, who lived another 16 years before he died in 1939. There are even examples of archaeologists finding curses scrawled on the insides of burial places, such as in the tomb of Kentika Ikeki from the 6th dynasty. The tomb, which was uncovered at the necropolis of Saqqara, contained a curse directed at the priests. The curse warned of dire consequences should they fail in preserving the purity of the resting place. The Templars Curse. The downfall of the Knights Templar happened rapidly after 200 years of military supremacy and lucrative financial dealings. In 1291, they lost the strategic city of Acre in northern Israel, bringing an end to any additional crusades in the eastern Mediterranean. Suddenly, the reputation of the order was tarnished. As rumors began to spread that the Knights Templar had lost their power, monarchs began plotting their demise. Philip IV of France, who felt threatened by the power, influence, and riches of the Knights Templar, convinced the Vatican to accuse them of corruption and heresy. In 1307, October the 13th to be exact, there were simultaneous raids throughout France. The Templars were imprisoned or burned alive at the stake. Jacques de Molay was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar when the order came to an end. He and 3 others were dragged through the court system, labeled as heretics, and kept alive while many of their brothers were slaughtered. It wouldn't be until March 18, 1314, that Molay and 3 of the other main Templar leaders were led to the pyres, where they would be burned alive. According to legend, as the flames began to consume Molay's body, he cursed King Philip and his family, and Pope Clement, who had allowed the Templars to be destroyed. Whether by coincidence or not, nobody can say. But 33 days after the execution, Pope Clement suddenly died, and just a couple months later, King Philip became ill and he also unexpectedly died. Over the next 10 years, King Philip's children died one by one, and his legacy was destroyed. The Torrp Runestone. Runes were an alphabetical system that the Vikings used over 1,000 years ago. Vikings didn't typically use them as means of communication, though. They didn't write letters to their friends. Instead, the runes were specifically used for communicating with the gods and for practicing magic. Vikings would create small talismans inscribed with runes as methods for keeping themselves safe. But the bigger the object, the more runes and the more magic that could be fit onto its surface. This brings us to the Torrp Runestone, found in the Swedish town of Blekinge. It's one of the tallest in the world, nearly 14 feet high and covered in mysterious runes. It's part of a grave and was likely accompanied by other runestones that have since been destroyed or pillaged. We know the runes on the stone were made around the 6th or 7th century AD. This was near the beginning of the Viking Age, with the runes being part of a Proto-Norse language that came before the more familiar Old Norse language. One of the inscriptions reads, "I predict perdition." The other reads, "I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Plagued by maleficence, doomed to death, is he who breaks this monument." At the very end, it says, "I prophesy the destruction." The inscription is a mystery that has never been solved. Someone appears to have had a vision of great doom, though there is no signature or hint as to the name of whoever carved it. Considering the runestone is still standing after 1,500 years, the Norse must have been scared enough to heed the warning and leave the stone alone. That's the power of the written word for you right there. Rich English magicians. The truth about medieval magic is that it was largely practiced by rich members of elite society following the Dark Ages. It wasn't lonely old crones in the woods casting spells over black bubbling cauldrons. Instead, historians say magic was a curiosity favored by those at the top of society, the ones who could afford it. In 1390, Duke Edmund de Langley paid a magician to help him locate some dishes that had been stolen from him. Alice Pereire, the mistress of King Edward III, used a magician to cast a love spell on the king in the 14th century to make him like her more. Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess of Gloucester, used a magician to help her conceive a child in the 15th century. However, Eleanor's dabble with magic got out of hand, and she was later accused of plotting to kill King Henry VI. If you were wondering how all of this was possible, given that Europe had a bit of a problem with burning alleged witches, that was only after 1542. 1542 was when the Act Against Witchcraft and Conjurations became official, making magic a criminal offense. Before that, magic was something used mainly by royalty and nobility who paid alleged sorcerers to borrow their abilities. Big shout out to Kiki Pods and Stable Stone. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Athens Curse Tablets. A shocking discovery was made in the downtown Athens neighborhood of Kerameikos. Archaeologists with the German Archaeological Institute of Athens came across a large collection of ancient curse tablets. A total of 30 tablets from 2,500 years ago were found buried at the bottom of an abandoned well. The well was originally found in 2016, but researchers only uncovered everyday items discarded as trash inside it. It wasn't until recently that the tablets were pulled out from the very bottom. Experts say the ancient tablets give a glimpse into the mystical beliefs of the classical period. Each tablet is engraved with a curse against someone the creator didn't like. So many cursed tablets have been found, not only here but in other places in Greece, that it appears to have been a really common practice. Someone would engrave a curse on a stone tablet, then stash it in a tomb or in a well, hoping the gods would read it. If the gods did read it, the idea was that they would then smite the person named and bring them great misfortune. All of this was done at a time when sorcery was expressly prohibited in Athens. Casting a curse on someone through a god was seen as a kind of loophole, since it was the god who would be doing the smiting. Merchants were some of the most notorious curse users. They would cast as many curses as possible in an effort to destroy the owners of rival businesses. Ancient Egyptian magic. Magic was one of the prevailing forces of nature in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians saw magic as something that was just part of the fabric of reality. Even more, magic was not reserved for elite priests or pharaohs. Anyone could invoke magic, assuming they had the correct spells and texts and could successfully complete the rituals. One of the most common uses of magic had to do with protection. Ancient people were terrified of pretty much everything. They were scared of evil infiltrating society. They were afraid of catching a disease, getting sick and dying, being killed by their neighbor, or even being bitten by a snake. There was the constant threat of an invading army and of unexpected illness. The best way for ordinary people to protect themselves against these threats was to employ magic. Something like an amulet or a wand could be taken to a priest, charged with magic like you might charge your phone, and then kept close to ward away bad things. There were lots of other types of magic too. There was the magic of the dead, wielded by death priests to assist the soul of the deceased on their journey to the other world. And yes, there was even black magic. This came in the form of curses and hexes, which could be used to try and destroy your enemies. The King's Cursed Tomb. In 1973, archaeologists were given permission to exhume the burial coffin of King Casimir IV Jagiellon. It was a major opportunity to inspect the tomb of one of the most famous Polish kings in history. Casimir was the son of King Władysław II Jagiello, born in November of 1427. Believe it or not, Władysław was 75 years old when Casimir was born, what some might call a miracle for the 15th century. Casimir's older brother was killed in battle in 1444, 1 year after their father's death. In 1449, when Casimir was old enough, he was crowned King of Poland. Casimir ruled for a very long time, dying at the age of 64 on a hot day in June of 1492. He died unexpectedly, and his death was incredibly mysterious. People were shocked to see that his body was decomposing insanely fast. The body was quickly covered in calcium salt, put in a coffin, and sealed with resin. It was then buried under the Wawel Cathedral. Prior to the coffin being opened in 1973, rumors began to circulate about a curse. The curse was said to have been placed on the body and would cause harm to any who bothered the great king's eternal slumber. The coffin was opened on April 13th, and in the following days, 4 researchers who participated in the exhumation of the body died. Over the next many months, 15 researchers who had either been at the site or handled the artifacts experienced health problems, and most of these people supposedly died at early ages. What do you think? Was this curse real, or is there some scientific explanation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Roman curses. Archaeologists searching through the ruins of the destroyed Roman town of Viminacium came upon gold and silver cursed tablets. Viminacium is located in modern Serbia, at what was once the edge of the Roman province of Moesia Superior. Much like how the Greeks used inscriptions on tablets to curse their enemies, so too did the Romans. The fad never really died during Roman dominion of Europe. One of the gold-inscribed tablets found in Serbia reads, "Let all the forces and demons help that... ... But the rest is illegible. It's not that the rest of the text can't be read, it's just that it makes no sense. Romans were unique in that they created a secret language to use when cursing people. This was to ensure the message could only be understood by the deities they were contacting. In this case, the language was only meant to be understood by demons. The Great Michael Scott. I don't mean this Michael Scott. Michael Scott was one of the most extraordinary people in Scottish history. He was a real man with connections to popes in the 13th century. He even had a professional relationship with Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Michael was a translator, a linguist, an astronomer, and an astrologer. He was also a famous alchemist. It was his study of the stars and the materials of the world that gave him a reputation of wizardry. Michael Scott was seen as a real-life wizard, and he is still one of the most famous wizards who ever lived in Europe. Michael was born around 1175, somewhere near the border of Scotland and England. The earliest biographical information we have about him was written by an Italian in 1553, almost 400 years after his death. He was titled Michael the Scot, judicial astrologer, servant of Emperor Frederick II. Dante's Divine Comedy even had Michael appear in the 8th Circle of Hell, where he's described as a magical fraud. We don't know what exactly Michael accomplished scientifically during his life. We know he made great strides in physiognomy, astrology, and the occult, and that he was a master of languages. He translated many important works of Aristotle. He was considered the most intellectual man of his era, but we don't have any official discoveries that he made in the realm of science. As for his wizardry, that's up for speculation. It wasn't until after Michael was dead that his magical abilities became legend. It was said he foresaw his own death, that a rock would one day fall on his head and kill him. For this reason, Michael allegedly walked around wearing an iron hat to prevent this. But the one time he took it off in church, a stone fell from above, hit him on the head, and he died. Michael Scott was also said to feast with spirits and to have once turned a coven of witches to stone. Greek magical papyri. If you've ever wanted to know the truth of ancient magic, you need the Greek magical papyri. It is a collection of ancient magic spells, not only from Greece, but from Rome and Egypt as well. It was written between the 2nd and 5th century BC and contains spells, rituals, hymns, and medicinal remedies collected from a wide range of sources. To be quite honest, the contents of the magical papyri are extraordinary. The spells were written in a mixture of Egyptian demotic and Greek text, with hints of Babylonian. It was a collection of many divination spells, revenge spells, charms, invocations of deities, and love spells. All of these came from magical practitioners who wrote their own texts throughout the years. You can think of it as an appendix of ancient magic put together by an unknown author. Unfortunately, there is only a single original text that was acquired in the early 19th century from Thebes. It has been translated and made available in English, but the original texts are mostly lost. Elizabeth Bathory. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was by far the most vicious female serial killer in history. However, it's difficult to know when exactly the facts run out and fiction begins. Was Elizabeth Bathory the real-life Count Dracula who bathed in the blood of her victims? Or was she simply an evil woman who did cruel things to her servants? What we know for sure is that the Countess was born in 1560 to a wealthy family. Her relatives ruled Transylvania within the Kingdom of Hungary as an independent principality. When Elizabeth was around 11 or 12 years old, she was betrothed to another aristocrat, Ferenc Nadasdy. Then, 2 years later, she had a baby. However, the child belonged to her lover of low status, not the man she had been betrothed to. Nadasdy was furious to hear of this baby, and he tortured Elizabeth's lover as a result. The child, born out of wedlock, was then quietly hidden from the public eye. Elizabeth was later married to Nadasdy at the age of 14, and the couple lived together in a fairy tale castle. But not quite with the fairy tale lifestyle. Not too long after their nuptials, rumors began to spread that Elizabeth was torturing and killing young girls. But she was still only a girl herself, which means she was probably an evil child or just had really bad experiences in her young life. At first, she only targeted her servant girls and the daughters of local peasants. But she later began to go after girls that were sent to her by local prominent families to learn good manners, like ladies in waiting. This is when people really began to take notice of Elizabeth's evil crimes. There were whispers that the woman drank the blood of the young girls because she thought it would preserve her youthfulness. Witnesses began to come forward, admitting to seeing Elizabeth slice her victims with scissors, stick them full of needles, and burn them with hot irons. Her husband eventually died in 1604 when Elizabeth was 43 years old. It wouldn't be until 1610 that the Hungarian authorities finally decided to investigate the alleged 600 murders she had committed. She was arrested in December of that year, then confined in a castle instead of being put on trial because of her status as a noblewoman. She lived out the rest of her days in solitary confinement until her death in 1614 at the age of 54. Daria Saltykova. Daria Saltykova was a Russian noblewoman born on March 11, 1730. She grew to be as notorious for her sadism in the Russian Empire as Elizabeth Bathory was in Hungary. This is due to the fact that she tortured and killed many young female serfs beneath her. Daria was born into wealth. Her father and mother were both part of noble Russian families, and so she was truly born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She would go on to marry a nobleman, and they had 2 sons. However, she was widowed in 1755 when she was only 25 years old. With her husband dead, Daria received a significant sum of money through inheritance. A large estate was also passed down to her, where she moved in with her sons and her serfs. Initially, complaints about deaths at the Saltykova estate were ignored by the authorities. Because Daria was so well connected in the Russian court and with the Russian nobility, the local police didn't want to get on her bad side. But after 138 suspicious deaths were reported, not even Daria could hide the truth. The families of the victims brought a petition before Empress Catherine II, who decided to make an example out of the noblewoman. Catherine had Daria tried publicly, and the royal murderer was later arrested in 1762. 6 years later, Daria was found guilty of killing 38 people. Since the death penalty had been abolished a few years earlier, the empress was not entirely sure how to punish Daria. She ended up displaying her on a public platform in Moscow with a sign around her neck detailing her crimes. Daria was humiliated before she was sent to prison to spend the rest of her days in a dusty cellar. She stayed there up until her death on December 9, 1801. Queen Anula. Queen Anula was the leader of an ancient kingdom called Anuradhapura, which dominated Sri Lanka starting in the 4th century BC. The kingdom would survive until the 10th century AD, lasting an impressive 1,400 years. According to historical records, Queen Anula ruled over Anuradhapura sometime in the 1st century BC. Much like any other ancient kingdom, this one was filled with ambition, betrayal, and assassinations. A man named Choranaga ruled over Anuradhapura following the death of his father. Chora reigned for 12 years and then suddenly died shortly after getting involved with a consort named Anula. It's believed she poisoned his food. When Choranaga's son took over the throne, he would rule for 3 years before he, too, was fatally poisoned. With the last heir dead, the seat of the kingdom went to a palace guard, who just so happened to be having an affair with Anula at the time. Not surprisingly, after ruling for just over a year, he was also killed by poison. After murdering 3 men at least, Anula finally became queen of Anuradhapura, but all of her work would be in vain. She only ruled for about 4 months before Kutakana Tisa, a man who belonged to the royal bloodline and fled the city in fear of Queen Anula, returned with an army. He then seized the throne and burned Anula alive in her own palace. Queen Elfrida. Queen Elfrida was born an English noblewoman sometime in the 10th century. Although we don't know what she looked like, historical records say that she was renowned for her beauty. She was so gorgeous that she attracted the attention of King Edgar of England. In order to see if the woman lived up to his standards, King Edgar sent his friend Ethelwold, a powerful nobleman, to visit Elfrida. However, when Ethelwold looked upon the woman's beauty, he fell in love with her, and he sent word to the king that she was misshapen, ugly, and dark. It was Ethelwold who would go on to marry Elfrida, and together they ruled an area the size of Normandy with little interference from the official royal family. But this wasn't enough for Elfrida. When her husband died in 962 AD, she would go on to marry King Edgar himself. It's even rumored that Edgar and Elfrida were in love the whole time, and that they plotted together to murder Ethelwold. Their marriage was as good as it got in the 10th century, but then Edgar died in 975, leaving her alone with his son Edward from a different woman and their fully biological son Ethelred. Elfrida was not pleased that Edward was next in line to inherit the throne. Then, after he was crowned king, he visited her in 978, where he suddenly turned up dead. His murder was blamed on a servant, although everyone is pretty sure it was Queen Elfrida. With the troublesome stepson dead, it was much easier for her own son Ethelred to take the throne. How far would you go for your own kids? Let me know in the comments below. Delphine Lalaurie. Delphine Lalaurie was an extremely wealthy woman who lived in New Orleans and is famous for torturing and murdering her slaves. Her family moved from Ireland to New Orleans in the late 18th century, and Delphine was born around 1775. She got married to a Spanish officer in the year 1800, and in 1804 they traveled to Spain. Delphine gave birth to a daughter on the boat during their journey, and before they reached Madrid, her husband was dead. Once they reached their destination, Delphine changed her mind about Spain and she sailed straight back to America. She went on to marry a banker shortly after her return, but 8 years later, he too wound up dead. So Delphine married a doctor named Leonard in 1825, and the two of them moved into a mansion. This was around the same time that rumors began to spread about Delphine. Although she wasn't technically nobility, she was part of a new generation of wildly wealthy Americans who were a lot like the European nobles. In 1834, a fire broke out at the couple's mansion. When the police investigated the incident, they found her cook dead and chained to the stove. Apparently, the man had been terrified that he would be sent to the attic for something he'd done wrong, and so he burned himself alive to avoid it. When the police searched the attic to see what the man was so afraid of, they found a secret torture room filled with the mutilated bodies of slaves. Delphine Lalaurie had been practicing some of the most inhuman torture imaginable, using primitive devices to mangle her own servants. In the end, an angry mob swarmed the mansion with the intention of dragging Delphine out, but she somehow managed to escape and was never seen again. Giulia Tofana. In the 17th century, Giulia Tofana was one of the most skilled murderers in Italy. She was born in Palermo in 1620, and 13 years later, her mother was executed for murdering her own husband. As she grew up, Giulia toiled with many different natural ingredients in order to become a master poisoner. She went on to start a business selling deadly poisons, which she would sell to women so they could kill their lovers, as she traveled across Sicily, Naples, and Rome. Giulia ran this successful business for many years as one of the world's first mafia crime bosses. She really was an underground queen of murder, supplying the weapon to get rid of hundreds of abusive and generally unlikable men. She remained the leader of Rome's murder scene up until everything came crashing down when one of her clients got cold feet. That same woman sold Giulia out to the authorities. Rome's great poisoner confessed to killing over 600 men from between 1633 and 1651. She was later executed in 1659, along with her own daughter and many of her associates. Anyone who was even remotely connected to Giulia was also killed. Elizabeth Brownrigg. Elizabeth Brownrigg was not born to a noble family, but to a working-class bloodline in 1720. She married a man named James who worked as an apprentice plumber, and they would have a total of 16 children. However, Elizabeth had atrocious luck, and only 3 of her babies survived through infancy. As time wore on, James became a successful plumber, and Elizabeth took on a job as a midwife. She was later given the appointment of overseer of women and children at the local parish. But just so like many women who came before her, Elizabeth was evil and twisted. Even though she wasn't nobility, she still had her own servants. Her job allowed her to have custody over several domestic servants, which was quite customary during the mid-1700s. Instead of being nice to them, Elizabeth tortured them. She would chain them to wooden beams and beat them and whip them mercilessly. She did even worse things that I can't go into too much detail about. Many of these servants escaped and went to the authorities, but it wasn't until Mary Clifford died from her infected wounds that Elizabeth was arrested and made to stand trial in August of 1767. Mary Clifford was only 14 years old at the time of her death. In the end, Elizabeth was found guilty and charged with murder. She was ultimately sentenced to be hanged for her awful crimes. Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev was the ruler of Kievan Rus between 945 and 960. She is known specifically for her brutal enslavement of the Drevlian tribe that was responsible for murdering her husband, Igor of Kiev. Olga's grandson Vladimir would eventually go on to convert the entire nation of Kievan Rus to Christianity. However, Olga is also admired by the Eastern Orthodox Church to this day for her part in the widespread conversion. When she was baptized, she was given the name Helena after the mother of Constantine the Great, who was a saint. She was the first woman to rule Kievan Rus, and she was only given the throne because her son was not yet old enough to take the position himself. But during her short time in power, she killed a lot of people. Like I mentioned, her husband was killed by the Drevlians after an unexpected uprising. The Drevlians were very successful and they became confident in themselves, so much so that they showed up to Kiev demanding that the queen marry the very warrior who killed her husband. Caught by surprise, the queen accepted and told the royal party to come back the next day. She was kind of in a difficult position here, you have to admit. What would you do if someone killed your husband and then forced you to marry them? Plus you're a woman in the 900s. Anyway, when they returned, they expected to be given honors and planned to take the widowed queen with them. But the Drevlians were in for a nasty surprise. The wedding party was tossed into a pit and buried alive while Olga watched. After that, she delivered a message to the Drevlians insisting they send more men to share in the festivities. However, when they arrived, Olga locked them all in the bathhouse and set it ablaze. What do you think? Serial killer or warrior queen? Let me know in the comments below. Alice Kittler. Alice Kittler was the first person to be officially condemned for witchcraft in Ireland. We don't know if she really was a witch or not, but she most certainly killed enough people that it turned the entire country against her. Alice was born to a wealthy family of aristocratic merchants in 13th century Ireland. She married William Outlaw in 1280, another wealthy merchant and prominent moneylender. He was also the mayor of Kilkenny, a respected position, but then he mysteriously died. Shortly after his death, Alice married another man named Adam in 1302, but he passed away as well. She went on to marry a third man named Richard Duval, an incredibly wealthy landowner. Shortly after they got hitched, he too wound up dead. Her fourth and final husband was Jean Lepeur, who also died after marrying Alice. After her fourth husband passed away under mysterious circumstances, it was fairly obvious that Alice had something to do with their deaths. The children of Jean Lepeur, as well as relatives of her previous marriages and her own stepchildren, accused Alice of using poison to murder her husbands. They also claimed she practiced sorcery, which gained the attention of the authorities. She was accused of sacrificing animals to summon demons, as well as having an intimate relationship with an incubus. It was also believed that she organized coven meetings with other witches. Just before she was to be executed for her crimes, Alice escaped and was never seen again. The mass poisoning of 331 BC. In 331 BC, 200 Roman women were charged with mass poisoning after multiple important people in the Senate died abruptly. Roman historian Titus Livius Patavinus is responsible for describing the sensational trial and the events leading up to it. It all started when important men inside the Senate began to drop dead like flies. An investigation team couldn't figure out what was going on until one of the women squealed on the rest of the guilty party. They soon learned that about 20 women of noble rank were cooking up poisons and then handing them out to other noblewomen to kill their husbands. According to Professor Richard Bowman, an expert in ancient Rome, this was part of a rebellion. Noblewomen wanted to kill their husbands as a way to protest against Roman marriage. At the trial, 30 of the women who had prepared their deadly tonics volunteered to drink them in order to prove they were totally harmless. However, they all dropped dead and avoided whatever horrific punishment the Roman Senate was planning to dish out. The fate of the other 170 women who had been involved in the murders is unknown, although it's believed they were driven into exile. Thanks for watching! What do you think? Killers or just misunderstood? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know if you'd like to see a part 2. There's lots more stories like these. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Bye!